following program is a production of WMFE, Orlando, Melbourne, Daytona Beach.
The Central Florida commute is getting worse.
Orlando is one of the highest congested areas in the U.S. of A.
People are spending more time in their cars and the ride is getting more expensive. The price of gas alone more than doubled in the last 5 years.
6 weeks ago, it put me into shock overload. I couldn't handle seeing the amount that I saw.
And those who live near a bus stop are not always happy to climb aboard.
It's very inconvenient. It takes you about 2 or 3 hours to get to one destination.
Others stay behind the wheel because they have no other option.
Right now, I think the public transportation situation in Orlando is not all that good.
While plans for a commuter rail are well underway, a major legal sticking point could derail them.
You got to be kidding me. I mean, that was honestly my first reaction.
And even if a commuter rail is built, making it convenient for passengers is a whole other challenge.
It's kind of like if you build it and it works, they will come.
In part one of a two-part special report, we explore why in Central Florida, transportation is at a crossroads. This week on WMFE.
Support for This Week is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to WMFE from viewers like you. Thank you.
You don't need your gym bag because...
No, we're not going to the gym.
Okay.
It's just another workday for Amy Noss and her fiancé, Terry Adrianson. They head toward I-4 in Sanford on their daily trip to Maitland. Sometimes the ride can get a bit wild.
I have kind of a lead foot.
Terry loves NASCAR, and I swear he gets behind the wheel and thinks he's a NASCAR driver.
With Terry at the wheel, the couple's Subaru navigates I-4 as hundreds of thousands of other cars do every day. But peering out of the window, Terry and Amy realize that traveling tandem the way they do is unusual in Central Florida, and not just on I-4. One after the other, after the other, after the other, drivers with no passengers pull into the toll lanes of the 408, Orlando's East-West Expressway. The official term is traveling by single-occupant vehicle. Nearly 8 out of 10 drivers travel alone, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. And experts say it's by far the most common way to get from point A to point B in Central Florida.
It's the mindset. Everybody loves to have their own car. It gives the freedom, flexibility. Definitely is a major factor.
A major factor in people's single-track minds when it comes to considering other ways to get around, like mass transportation or even carpooling. Just 10% of people in our area ride to work with others.
I'm kind of selfish. I don't like to rely on other people's schedule.
Over the years, the single-occupant vehicle became the obvious transportation choice in Central Florida. It's a region of sprawling suburbs rather than dense central city areas. The National Research Council recognized this as a troubling trend 10 years ago. Its report said the trend made both carpooling and mass transportation far less feasible. Too many faraway destinations popped up. That, coupled with increasing incomes, falling gasoline prices, and the ever-increasing availability of cars, led to 22 million more vehicles on the nation's roads during the 1980s alone. In the last 10 years, nearly 900,000 more cars were registered in Florida.
Of course, the big boost that happened building freeways, everybody is enjoying things that happened 50 years ago when we built the system.
With more people driving alone, traffic gets worse. The Texas Transportation Institute found the Orlando area is among the top 10 most congested regions in the country, joining the ranks of Los Angeles and Atlanta. Terry deals with the traffic every day. Despite the many brake lights on I-4 near Lee Road, he says the backup isn't all too bad today.
It's 16 miles from Sanford to Lee Road, and some mornings it was 16 miles of just really bad traffic.
Psychiatrist Dr. Herndon Harding says the underlying factor for people wanting to have their own car is rooted in the psyche.
Most people don't like to feel controlled. Americans, we tend to, again, be very much a democratic kind of society and feel that we have a right to not only have a say in things, but particularly have self-determination.
It's our nature to want to have that independence, to not have to worry about what somebody else is doing.
Cultural factors also drive people to their addiction to cars.
Given our choice, Americans tend to want more space. Even our houses tend to have more space. It's not so much that Americans have a uniform difference of space than some of the other cultures. Again, if you go to subways, they'll crowd together more.
Until he gets to work in Maitland, Terry shares his space with his fiancée. With a quick kiss, Amy climbs into the driver's seat to continue her trip to work, just one exit away. Like many Central Floridians, she used to drive most places on her own, but the cost of gas on her credit bill was the straw that broke the camel's back.
6 weeks ago, it put me into shock overload. I couldn't handle seeing the amount that I saw. For me, it took, almost a $500 gas bill to make me say, okay, forget my inconvenience, forget my independence. I'm just going to do this.
If at some point your pocketbook is hit too much with rising fuel costs, at some point anybody is at least going to consider, should I carpool? Should I take the bus? Only when it gets painful enough that they say, yeah, I'm willing to go ahead and go with that value instead of my individualism, then that flips the switch and changes the behavior.
Changing the behavior of those who insist on driving alone is becoming a more important priority for local leaders, considering the impact it has. Research shows traffic congestion creates a $78 billion annual drain on the U.S. economy. For the typical 9-to-5er, it means an extra 38 hours time in the car a year and another $710 in wasted gas. That's about 2 more fill-ups a month. Pollution is a concern, too. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection says the Metro Orlando area is dangerously close to not meeting new air quality requirements from the federal government. That means our risk for smog is higher than many other areas in Florida, even Miami. With the negatives adding up, Dr. Harding says people will gradually change, and carpooling, trains, and even the bus will become more attractive options.
People adapt. People in subways and in the T and the elevated system in Chicago, people use them and do just fine.
Longwood resident John Cheat says he's sticking to his car for now, but he's open to changing in the future.
I would consider public transportation too, whether it be bus or light rail, which has been talked about. But right now, I think the public transportation situation in Orlando is not all that good as far as the scheduling of buses and that kind of thing. So it isn't an option for me right now.
Nor is it an option for Amy. But by carpooling, she's doing her best to keep one less car on the road. It's still dark outside, and Richard Burney has a long trek ahead of him. He would normally drive his car from his home in Avalon Park to work over in Orlando's Baldwin Park. Not today. At the request of WMFE, Burney agreed to try Lynx, the bus service serving Orange, Seminole, and Osceola counties. While carefully planning his route, he discovered problem number 1. He has a nearly 4-mile walk just to get to the nearest bus stop.
And then I was thinking about it, maybe it won't be so bad if I leave it early, but that's just too far.
The sun is up, and he's still walking, with sweat dripping down his face. He's got to walk fast. Problem number 2. If he misses his bus, he'll have to wait an hour and a half for the next one. And even if the bus is on time, his 14-mile journey will still take him over 3 hours with transfers to 3 different routes.
It's too time consuming to take a bus. You have to plan your whole day around just taking the bus.
There were over 26 million journeys made on Lynx last year, but unlike Bernie, many of the riders depend on the service and have to put up with its faults day in, day out. 3/4 of Lynx passengers are using it to get to work. In fact, most of them couldn't get there without it. A combination of Orlando's basic geography, its suburban sprawl, and the growing cost of running a car is leaving low-wage employees with no alternative. It's Lynx or nothing. And Lynx riders are hardly an influential demographic, mostly young, low-paid, and minorities. While most Orlando residents never have to ride the bus and don't care about the service, those who are stuck with it are well aware of its shortcomings.
So it's very inconvenient. It takes you about 2 or 3 hours to get to one destination. You can't get a bus when you need a bus. You can't get a bus when you get off work at like 6:30 in the evening. You can't get a bus to where you live in the city. I had to move away from where I was going to be living because I couldn't get a bus home.
And even if you're lucky enough to be near a bus route, according to the latest data from Lynx, the average trip takes 1 hour and 23 minutes, with wait times for buses clocking in anywhere between 1 hour and 90 minutes if they're on time. 1 in 4 buses are not, which means waiting in the baking Florida sun or heavy rain, since less than 1 in 10 bus stops have shelters. Experts like Dr. Assam Radwan of the University of Central Florida say improving Lynx is vital, not just for its present passengers, but for Orlando to keep up with other big cities.
I think we're behind because I believe that as much as we try to be innovative, trying to market public transportation here in Central Florida, it's just not happening because the way the area developed, urbanization, the sprawl, even the road system is not sufficient either. Unfortunately, you will not be able to compete with other metropolitan areas until you really have a good public transportation.
And Radwan says bringing Lynx up to standard will have a big price tag.
Anytime you put more buses on the road, you will have to have labor, drivers driving it, okay? And to make it efficient enough, the frequency of the buses has to be high. You don't want to wait there for an hour and a half. You want to be 30 minutes is a good time. So 30 minutes is doubling the number of buses, doubling the number of drivers. So there's a capital investment there.
Lynx is already heavily subsidized by local and national government. Just 18% of its $114 million annual budget comes from fares. That makes asking for extra cash even harder in the current economic climate. The catch-22 for Lynx? Without improving services, it can't attract new riders to bring in more fares.
If these buses are not full, you're not going to bring in money. So it's a downward spiral type thing. You know, you keep putting money in and it doesn't bring enough money. And that's where people say, we don't want to bail out that system. It's taking too much money.
And Lynx is in trouble just maintaining current services. The agency is millions of dollars over budget for 2009. Because of that, 18 routes will be cut or significantly reduced. This is just phase 1 of Lynx's 2-part plan to climb out of a huge financial hole. It's a worry for Lynx rider Ryan Whittemore. He uses the bus every day and has for the past decade. His route may be cut.
It's going to impact me a lot, especially if they cut this bus, because this is the only bus I have to get from home to work.
Local leaders are considering new funding plans for Lynx, including a 1-penny gas tax. But approval promises to be an uphill battle.
We know that it's not profitable. We know that somebody has to subsidize it. So anytime it goes on a referendum or anybody has to vote on it to support it, people say, no, we don't want to support it because it's going to be a lost case. Something drastic has to happen to change the attitude about public transportation and about land use development. And it has to be a major commitment from the top and filters down. And it hasn't happened yet, unfortunately.
Back in Baldwin Park, it's 9:15, and after a 4-mile walk and changing buses 3 times, Richard Burney has finally arrived at work. A journey that normally takes just half an hour in the car has taken him over 3 hours, and he isn't finished yet. He has to clean up and change his sweat-drenched shirt. No prizes for guessing whether taking the bus will become part of his daily routine.
I would not do this on a daily basis, not at all.
This is your southbound train to Miami Airport, making all intermediate stops. Please stand back from the edge of the platform as the train arrives and thank you for riding further.
It's the morning rush in West Palm Beach, and biology professor Mary Grant hops on the train just in time to get to work in Boca Raton. Rose Davis is also on board.
I get on the bus, I go to the Tri-Rail station, get on the Tri-Rail station, the train, and go to my mom's.
She enjoys a coffee and often a good book while traveling to visit her elderly mother in Dania Beach. Just one row back, Sandy Nelson listens to her iPod. She's on the way to her new job at the Rent-A-Center in Pompano Beach.
Currently, I just don't have a vehicle, but even if I did, it's a lot cheaper.
Further down the line in Fort Lauderdale, Benjamin Robbins climbs aboard with his bike. He ditched his car to avoid a busy drive on I-95.
I know it would take me a lot longer, and to me it's frustrating just sitting in traffic, so I would rather, I like riding my bike.
Avoiding chaotic I-95, thousands of people rely on South Florida's 72-mile-long commuter rail system to get around every day. And, if all goes to plan, Central Floridians will have a strikingly similar system in less than 3 years.
It's quite similar to Tri-Rail in South Florida.
Noran Downs heads up the Central Florida Division of the Florida Department of Transportation. She's overseeing the development of a $615 million commuter rail system in Central Florida. The system would eventually connect cities at 17 stations along the I-4 corridor, including Sanford, Altamont Springs, Orlando, and Kissimmee.
Well, we actually studied what happened in South Florida, what went good, what went bad.
With that, Central Florida planners are trying to avoid the pitfalls that troubled South Florida's system for years. Former Broward County Commissioner Ed Kennedy prides himself on his key role in setting up what's now known as South Florida's Tri-Rail nearly 20 years ago. Trains there only started running because of a massive reconstruction of the major traffic artery connecting West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami.
It started as a traffic shunt-off from when they started working on I-95, expanding it.
20 years later, Central Florida is now facing the same scenario. A $2.5 billion reconstruction of I-4 is now being planned. As roadwork collides with worsening traffic on an already overburdened I-4, local leaders believe Central Floridians will be begging for an alternative, and they say commuter rail is it.
It's because people from Volusia do commute down to Osceola County or to Orange County, and we're so spread out, you take that distance times the congestion, and therefore you're in your car a lot longer.
Even with growing congestion, Kennedy says you can't assume Central Floridians will rush to park their cars and flock to the train.
It's kind of like if you build it and it works, they will come.
Kennedy says Tri-Rail didn't work very well in the early days. At one point, more than half of the Tri-Rail trains ran late, leading to record lows in ridership. Transportation officials projected Tri-Rail would have 14,000 riders a day in its first year. The actual number was just 3,000. Kennedy says it all boiled down to CSX dispatch priorities. Tri-Rail often had to defer to freight trains and Amtrak, especially since CSX would get bonuses if Amtrak trains were on time.
When we put our trains on the track, you got to remember it was a single line track. When Amtrak came down, almost when they hit Jacksonville, they would put our tri-rail on a siding and wait for Amtrak, sometimes as much as 2 hours, 3 hours. And our customers were waiting in a train, waiting for Amtrak to come by, which was always late. They're still late.
Like in South Florida, Central Florida commuter trains will share the tracks with freight and Amtrak passenger trains. Though freight won't be allowed during rush hour, but all trains still must defer to Amtrak, creating the possibility of delays. Down says those delays will be minimized because state government will be in charge of dispatching instead of an outside company as in South Florida.
You guarantee that your trains get there on time because you're dispatching it. It'll be interoperable. CSX will still have some freight trains going through because you do have to move people and goods through Central Florida as well. But we will have control and authority to make sure our trains are on time. We don't have to wait for somebody else.
Kennedy says to this day, Tri-Rail's early legacy of late commuter trains seriously hurts the system's success. So Central Florida should be extra cautious.
What happened is people started to ride it, but if you could not provide good service, they're not going to ride it. In other words, 2 bad instances and they give up.
Flexibility proved crucial too.
Another thing we found out, which was a peculiarity, we ran trains in the morning and we ran trains in the evening for commuters. And we were wondering why we didn't get more commuters. And we did a survey, and it turned out that people were concerned if they went to work in the morning, they couldn't get back until 5 o'clock train. Once we started a noon train, ridership increased about 15%.
Plans call for the Central Florida commuter rail to run trains every 30 minutes during peak times and every 2 hours in the off-peak. Frequency and convenience will be the most important factors for Central Florida. According to Kennedy, he says commuter rail is destined to fail if riders have a difficult time getting to and from the train stations. To this day, he says South Florida struggles.
The buses are terrible. The buses, we have in Broward County, I'd say about 198 buses. Toronto, Canada has something like 1,500 buses. In other words, that's the difference we're talking about. The rule of thumb is you can, I think it's about 5 blocks. You should have, every citizen in your community should not have to walk any more than 5 blocks to get on a public system. My hope was that because the rail was in, the government would build on it and expand on the infrastructure, which they never did.
Here in Central Florida, loose agreements are in place with local bus systems Lynx and Votran. Even though both systems are now facing large budget cuts, state officials have promised to fund future routes that connect to commuter rail stations. South Floridians say the bus system has always been the weakest link in their journeys.
Dade and Broward County, they run till late at night, but in Palm Beach County, like 8, 9 o'clock, that's it. So if you work late, you need to have a ride home.
I mean, usually you have to take an earlier bus to make sure that you get an earlier train because the times don't always coincide. I probably wait longer at a bus stop than I do on the train to get from here to Pompano.
Beyond buses, there are other reasons South Floridians avoid the train and stick to their cars.
I don't ride it because I'm a 26-year-old female and safety is key to me. So I'm safer in my own car with my cell phone and with people around me that I know.
In order for me to get a tri-rail system, it'd have to be within walking distance to where I'm living and, you know, so on and so forth. Wherever I'm going, it has to be walking distance. If not, then I'll have to catch a cab or somebody have to drop me to the tri-rail station and I have to take it. Somebody got to pick me up, so I still got to inconvenience somebody. So I just prefer to drive.
Conservative ridership projections show just 4,000 Central Floridians will catch the train each day during the first year of operation. More than 20 years later, nearly 15,000 passengers are expected to climb aboard. Considering the system's $615 million price tag, that works out to more than $41,000 per rider. Not to mention the millions of taxpayer dollars the commuter train will cost to operate each year. But both Kennedy and Downs say it's a worthwhile investment, and that taxpayers often don't think about the real price of other forms of transportation.
Funding for this, of course, is subsidized. It's always subsidized, but actually every roadway that you're on is subsidized. We have to resurface our roads, and that's taxpayers' monies as well.
People don't realize how much the automobile costs the community, just in maintenance, just in accidents, and the medical scenario that you have to have on call for automobile accidents, and the lighting, the clearing of intersections, and the red lights, and the amount of law enforcement. I could go on and on and on. As far as you want to see what the automobile costs the average citizen, you add on all this stuff, like they add on all this stuff with public transit, and there's no comparison. Public transit comes out on top every time.
Only part of the cost to operate commuter rail will come from those who actually ride it. Just 25% of costs are typically recovered from train fares. In Central Florida, a one-way fare will cost between $2 and $4.
There's not a public transit system in the world that makes a profit, and that's people get critical of that. But you know, it's just like schools don't make a profit, hospitals don't make a profit generally, public hospitals. It's a public service.
Federal tax dollars will cover about 1/3 of the cost to run the Central Florida commuter train. For the first 7 years, state tax dollars will cover the rest. For year 8 and beyond, the bulk of the expense will fall to taxpayers in the city of Orlando, Orange, Seminole, Osceola, and Volusia counties.
Well, the locals have committed to funding it. They have an agreement, an operational agreement, that they will make this a priority for them.
Just like South Florida's Tri-Rail, the Central Florida commuter rail doesn't yet have a dedicated funding source. Long term, this makes the system vulnerable to the constant threat of budget cuts from local government. Funding for Tri-Rail has been volatile for nearly 20 years. In 1996, Miami-Dade completely pulled its Tri-Rail financing for a year. Kennedy says state leaders need to put a stop to this to ensure the success of commuter rail.
In other words, you got to get a buy-in from the political sector that yes, we're going to look, in addition to roads and bridges and infrastructure, we're going to look to a unified public transit system in the state of Florida. And we're going to work in conjunction with the feds and the local governments to provide that. The state's the only one that can do that.
Despite its past and present faults, South Floridians who rely on the train say it's worth all the trouble.
4:30, 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the afternoon. Yeah, you look out and you're glad you're on the train and not sitting in the traffic.
Even if I had a car, I'd probably just park it at the train station. I mean, I never realized how convenient the train station was.
I don't know how long I'll continue to do it. I mean, but you know, when you live 30 miles from home to work, then you know, it kind of is beneficial, save you money.
Monetary savings aside, Central Florida commuter rail is far from finalized. Unless state lawmakers act during the next session, the plan may be forever derailed. Next time on WMFE's This Week. A major sticking point is threatening to stop Central Florida commuter rail in its tracks.
If we don't get the legislator approval, then we're not going to buy the tracks.
We'll tell you what the holdup is and why some say the whole plan is just a billion-dollar handout to a private company.
There are those who are willing to do this, no matter what the cost.
Join us for part 2 of our special in-depth report, Transportation at a Crossroads. Next time on WMFE's This Week.